In today's text, we have another kind of challenging sense of how we are called to forgive. And there's a number of things with this story that I think are important to kind of spell out. So we'll walk through the story first. To begin with, we have a parable. Peter is asking Jesus a question. Jesus answers the question and then tells a story about it, this parable. One of the things about parables is that you're not supposed to pick at the loose threads of the parable. Every parable that we have, we are desperately wanting to pick at the loose threads, and you're not supposed to do that. You're just supposed to read it at face value and get to the end and understand kind of what's going on. And so we'll walk through that. So I want to start, though, with Peter's question. Peter says, "Lord, how much must I forgive another member of the church?" Curious thing for a disciple to ask, given that there wasn't a church yet, but that's another question. How many times do I need to forgive another member of the church? 7 times? And Jesus says, not just 7, but 70 times. Now, it's interesting. Peter, this is an important point here, Peter seems to have no concern about how many times the other members of the church need to forgive him. Now, that's a funny part, but key. It is key. His concern is how much he's got to forgive that other guy. So I think in the Greek, the way this passage goes is that Peter approaches Jesus and says, "Jesus, I'm a rock star and don't have any faults. And so nobody ever needs to forgive me, but I get weary of having to forgive my fellow usher Bob every single week. So just what, 1 time more, 2 times, 7 maybe? How long do I have to put up with this guy?" It's kind of the longer version of what's going on there. And Jesus says 70 times, but you're clearly not getting it. So let me tell you a story. And now we have the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a king. God is like a king. And this king has a slave. And this slave owes the king 10,000 talents. Now, I know you want to just immediately Google and see what the current exchange rate is for talents versus US dollars. I'll help you with that. It's a lot. It's a crazy lot of money. 1 talent is huge. In fact, as we look at 10,000, it would be roughly comparable to, say, 150,000 to 200,000 years worth of work. It is literally like 3 to 5 billion with a B dollars. Now, I know you're wanting to pick at that thread. How could that slave possibly have owed that much money to the king? It's not questions you're supposed to ask. It's just the story. So this slave owes a ton of money to the king. The king turns to him and says, "That's it, you got to pay up, or I'm going to put you in prison and sell off your family." And the slave immediately responds very rationally, "Give me a few days. I can pull this money together." And you can picture the thought bubble. I could ask my Uncle Ted. Maybe my parents would help out. At some point in the next week or two, this $3 to $5 billion is just going to go away, right? Right. Perhaps like Peter, this slave doesn't really understand the magnitude of his debt to the king. I think as we look at these readings today, we recognize that we often see ourselves as being in perhaps small debt, if anything, and not tremendous debt. When we look at others, we maybe see imperfections in them that are grossly magnified out of all proportion to our own faults and brokenness. As we said at the beginning of the service together, we confess that we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. And it makes us uncomfortable. That's not our self-view, right? Well, I've done a few things wrong, but why are we doing this confession every week anyway? Now, Bob, he needs confession every week. But me, on the other hand, I'm a good guy. I'm a good guy. When we see faults in others and magnify them beyond anything of ours, we are slipping from the way in which Christ views the world. That we don't see others as sisters and brothers, but as problems, as broken people we have to put up with, and never asking how often people have to put up with us. The slave begs the king and says, how do I get out of this? Give me a few days. And the king, seeing the desperation, shows mercy and doesn't say, I tell you what, take the rest of the year to pay me off. Do you notice that the text says, the king forgives the entire debt? Wow. Wow. Now the slave gets up and walks out, and we hear nothing about this amazing sense of relief or this profound sense of gratitude for the mercy shown. In fact, the absence of anything like that suggests that perhaps the slave just thought, well, of course, I'm a pretty good guy. Slave goes out and finds another slave who owes him money. Now, this is a much smaller amount of money, 100 denarii. It's not nothing. It's about 100 days' worth of labor, so significant, but certainly not the 10,000 talents that the first slave owed. And do you notice how violent the language is? The slave seized him by the throat and demanded that he pay everything back and threw him into debtor's prison. Well, that didn't sit well with friends, other slaves, saying, whoa, hey, what are you doing? This is all out of proportion. And weren't you just the one that the king forgave this massive debt? What are you doing? What are you doing? So eventually the king hears, and the first slave is summoned back in, and the king is not happy. You will pay this off forever until it's done. Now, there's a lot going on in this text, but there's a couple of things. When we do not forgive, there is a guilt and a punishment that carries with us all the days of our lives. And we carry this burden with us in a way that affects everything. Bear with me here, a visual image. When I was working at Mount Cross Camp as a counselor, there was a pastor who came and during staff training did a bit of theological education during our time. And he had this large glass jar. It was kind of like an oversized mason jar. And he would put his hand in this empty jar and take it out. It was quite easy to do because the mouth of it was pretty good size. And what he would do at that point is he'd drop a golf ball into this jar and say this golf ball is like a wrong that somebody else has done to us. And he would put his hand in and hang on to that golf ball. And you know what? Suddenly he couldn't get his hand out of the jar. He was trapped. And this pastor would very theatrically walk around the room waving this glass jar everywhere, trapped. by his unwillingness to let go of that golf ball, that symbol of our unwillingness to forgive, and the brokenness that we carry, something that hinders us every single day. When we think of this text, there's two pieces that I think are so important. One, this idea that we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. And that when we talk about forgiveness, it is every bit as much about the debts that we owe others and the forgiveness that we ourselves are in need of, as it is about our need to forgive others, to understand how merciful God has been with us, that we might live in that mercy towards others. And then I think, secondly, the punishment that we carry around in ourselves when we are unwilling to forgive, something that walks with us day in and day out and hinders our ability to live in community in love. May the Lord this week teach us how to forgive and teach us to understand how much we have been forgiven. Amen.